of this wonderful group of instructors or facilitators or just people that speak at you for this week. I'm part of LA Compost. Born and raised here in Los Angeles. I started LA Compost about 2012. It's a bike-powered collection model early on. LA's too big for that to be really successful. So we kind of created this on-site decentralized network of community composting hubs. Really excited to share 2 of those with you in person today on the actual trip. And today we're going to be talking about compost processing, pile monitoring. How are we doing this across all forms of scales from community composting? I think one of the biggest things we want to be mindful of is how are we intentional before we actually start composting? How are we over-planning? How are we really being thoughtful about everything that we're going to be bringing in, everything that we're going to be processing, who's going to be involved, to really ensure that it's a smooth and pleasant process for all parties involved. When I think about just like community composting and the planning process, I kind of think about like the kitchen setup right here, kind of like what Eleanor did, right? It was like kind of a last minute change. They understood that there was going to be a certain amount of people here, a certain amount to feed. There was intention behind the way that kitchen was set up, and from seeing it on the sideline, it just seems like it's flowing well. It's really thoughtful and it's intentional as far as how things are moving. That's kind of the intention and strategy we want with our composting as well. Going into it with just like, well, I know I need mulch, I know I need to cover my food scraps, I know I need to do this. I think it's really important to overplan before you actually begin. Early on, City of LA gave us some grant money. They're like, hey, do 10 hubs in 30 days. I'm like, yeah, sure, I can do that. And it was like 10 different communities, 10 different gardens, 10 different zip codes. And sure, I know how to build a 3-bin in a day, but without doing the community engagement, without taking the time for site plan, without recognizing that the water hose was 300 feet away, all these things could have been avoided. All these issues could have been avoided if I just took the time to plan. And it's okay to say no, or yes, but it's going to take this much time. So I know our biggest roadblock oftentimes is resources, and when there's money available, it's really exciting to move forward with that. But I guess today I really want to go over this idea of planning, taking our time, and being mindful of the flow of materials and the flow of people that are going to come into our spaces. One of the biggest reasons why a community composting site often closes is due to kind of like, thank you, man, I probably should be following this. So let me give you a purpose and overview of what we're talking about. It's kind of rainy back in, but yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about today. I think it's really important for us to recognize, why do community composting sites close? Is it because there's no one to manage it? Is it out of resources? Honestly, it's complaints and issues that come from neighbors or outside community, right? We talk about this NIMBYism, not in my backyard. The fact that people actually smell with their eyes. So if the compost pile, when we came into Amy's farm, you had these beautiful compost mountains that were just inviting, right? I think you all like stuck your hand in there yesterday and it was just like, you wanted to experience it. So I think the fact that we want to ensure that the presentation, the aesthetic is somewhat appealing, to ensure that it's quote unquote not as threatening for those that are unaware or don't know exactly what it is we're doing. We want to make sure we're not impacting any wildlife, any of our leachate or runoff is impacting the surrounding community, and planning, recognizing best management practices for the scales in which we're doing, and really just planning adequate capacity. I think it's really exciting when we are given a space to compost. I think sometimes we think we can do it all, right? I think it's easy for us to just take on perhaps more than we can process. And everything that I'm sharing is because I am guilty of it. And my team can also attest to that. It's like, oh, farmer's market that's going to collect 6,000 pounds in 4 hours? Absolutely, we'll take it. Oh, 16 pallets from Food Forward, all cucumbers individually wrapped by plastic? Sure, yeah, we can probably do it. It's like, yeah, like, how are your decisions affecting your volunteers, your staff, and the community members who are actually having to process that? And then does the site then have the trash can and the capacity to manage all the materials that's coming as well? If it's individually plastic, if they're rotted CSA boxes with the waxy coat of cardboard. Being mindful of everything in that process is really important. Compost is a lot like baking and cooking, as I mentioned, so knowing your recipe, knowing your feedstocks, knowing where this material is coming from, and working with what you have, right? I think I'll always say that composting is a spectrum, and I think it's important to try not to compare what you're doing with other groups, just because your situation is your situation, your space is your space, and the feedstocks that are readily available to you are your feedstocks, right? Sure, we can try to get this best horse manure or alfalfa or clover and coffee grounds, but how much energy are you using, and do you have that capacity? Are the materials coming to you? Do you have the space to store those materials? So being really mindful of what's available to you and making the best compost with what's available. I'm a believer that composting is very forgiving. You never really ruined it to the point of not having something of value. And I'm a strong believer that the learning is in the doing. We can speak to you, we can show you videos, you can read your books, but you kind of have to make mistakes. You kind of have to learn by doing. And the beauty of that is your lived experience then becomes your skill set. It becomes your tool belt to share and knowledge share with those around you. And the reason why I even get to teach workshops at like different municipal levels, because I failed more than the entire audience collectively. Quote unquote failed. Learned by doing, essentially. It's really important, as I said, to plan, to practice, and to involve the community so it's not solely on your shoulders. This work is labor intensive unless you have a tractor, a skid steer, or bucket loader. Oftentimes it's in the heat, outside, and sometimes I think we forget that like our community members may have never used a pitchfork or a shovel or a hand tool, and taking the time to educate, equip, and empower them to be the facilitators of this space as well. So we're going to go into logistical considerations. One of the things we're mindful of is no matter the scale of any of our sites, there's some type of management that needs to take place. There's no such thing as just like a dump and forget, because we're managing resources, we're managing food scraps that when left exposed, when left unattended, can cause some disturbance in the neighborhood and the community. So just being mindful of the fact that we're dealing with the material that is an organic material that's quickly decomposing. We want to ensure that we're managing it in the best way. So when it comes to logistical considerations, one of the things I'd like to think about are like, what are the feedstocks that are readily available to us? What are we using? How is it getting here? And do we have the space for us to store it properly? So I know yesterday you talked about your browns, your greens, your high nitrogens. In Los Angeles, we get a lot of our material from people that come and drop it off. So we have like 35 locations, schools, churches, museums, community gardens, housing projects, working with city parks now. So the majority of folks are actually bringing their food scraps to drop off, which we'll get into, which makes it a lot easier for us. We also work with some micro haulers that could bring it to us. And then we've partnered with the city of LA, where we create farmers market food scrap drop-off collections. But regardless of what you do, it's really important to recognize what are you collecting and how are you storing it. On the carbon side, we have the luxury of working with all the arborists and all of the landscape companies. They actually have to pay to dump that material. You can't use it as alternative daily cover anymore. So every truckload is $200 to $300 to dump at the landfill, and it's free to dump to us, and it's our perfect carbon material, right? We're doing them a favor, they're doing us a favor, and it's nicely piled in a corner or wherever we designate it in our space. We often ask, how many yards is your truck? And then we're able to calculate and record the adequate metrics, the appropriate metrics for that carbon as well. I know when we compost, it's food scraps, food scraps, food scraps, but your manures, your carbon, your wood chips, your sawdust, your shavings, all of that's organic material that was most likely destined for the landfill. So it's important to capture every and all metrics that are coming into your site. Also in LA, we work with a lot of lumber yards that work with untreated wood. So there's a company in Los Angeles called Angel City Lumber, and all the trees that kind of fall down in LA, they actually capture them and make floors or tables and chairs. They create about 20 cubic yards of saw shavings a month. And our team picks it up weekly and distributes it across our network. So really being scrappy and mindful about where there's resources and how you can get them to your site is really important. And then your high nitrogens, like your brewery materials, your coffee grounds. In LA, there's no shortage of coffee shops, and they're happy to bring it to you often. And then your stable bedding it takes a little bit more planning and strategizing as well. Where we store this material is really important as well, and how we store it. You might not think, oh, it's just a big pile of mulch, or oh, it's a big pile of sawdust. But ensuring that there's clearance around the piles kind of eliminates the friends that burrow in and out and around the pile as well.
And then with our food scraps, if we're not getting to them within 24 hours or 40 hours, 48 hours, are they covered? Are they stored? Are they leaking? How are we actually storing those materials? And when we go to our site at the Audubon Center at Debs Park, we use just these 27 plastic gallon totes that you might see at Home Depot, yellow lid, black body. They stack really nice. They're easy for 2 people to kind of lift and dump into a windrow. But just really, how are we storing our materials? And again, going back to the cooking concept, if we go to the grocery store and we pick something that was frozen, how are we storing it? Are we gonna let it just sit on the counter? Is it gonna be out in the sun? Or we know we have to put it somewhere in a timely manner? Water. Do we have water access? And if we do, how far is it? Because sure, I can rig up 300 feet of linear hose, but if the pressure is so low, it's gonna be a little bit of a sneeze on your piles. Is it purple pipes or is it potable water? And if it is purple pipes, reclaimed water, what's the salinity level? How high is the salt content in those pipes? And is that going to affect our finished compost? So simple test is really important as well. And then what type of system are we actually going to use? Is this a community scale 3-bin system, a wire system, a backyard bin system? Or are we going to do larger piles, turned by staff, turned by community members, turned by volunteers and interns, that requires a different level of management? And then what type of equipment do we have? How many of us have turned compost windrows before? How many of us have tried to do it with a shovel? So pitchforks, also 5-tine pitchforks versus a 3-tine pitchfork versus a 20-tine pitchfork. Not all pitchforks are created equal, right? If you've tried a shovel with 3-tine pitchfork, you just got good exercise but no material going over your shoulder because everything's just falling through. Similarly, if you try to do it with a 20-tine pitchfork, good luck getting that stuff off, right? Everything's wrapped around, everything's stuck, and then you just become frustrated with composting when it should be a very life-giving process from all that it does. So 5-tine if you can. But also, work with what you got. If you only got shovels, quote unquote, you're gonna be scrappy and you're gonna get it done. But the right tool for the right job makes it much more pleasant. So the overall process, depending on what your process is, hypothetically speaking, we're gonna talk about the way we do it with LA Compost. So every Sunday from 10 to 2, we have a farmer's market food scrap collection. The city of LA supported this pilot program and they wanna see this expand across all 15 districts. First Sunday we arrived, we had about 6 people. We're like, all right, cool. We filled up half a tote in 4 hours. Wow, great use of our time. 6 months into it, we had about 300 families showing up. And it was really kind of self-serve. We set up a table, they weighed it themselves, they recorded it, and they gave a donation if they wanted to the point where the program pays for itself. The donations we receive from the community members pay for the staff member who's behind that table. We give away seedlings, it's a nice little event, but every time people are dropping off and weighing that material, and every time that tote is full, our staff is also weighing it, recording it, and putting it in the Sprinter van. So regardless of what you're doing in terms of collection, if it's a food scrap drop-off collection at a community garden, if it's a farmer's market collection, if it's a micro bike hauling service, recording is so important because this work can often sometimes from the outside just, oh, that's cute, that's cool what they're doing. But how do we show that this human network across the state of California actually has an impact from a numbers, from a diversion standpoint? And we can only show that if we have accurate metrics. Right? It's like, oh, that's cute. They're in the community gardens and, they're working with community members and volunteers. Like, oh, wow, 10 sites diverted 2 million pounds of solely food scraps that last year with minimal resources. I think what we're trying to show is the impact that we can collectively do because I don't think any of us are trying to create this Costco, Walmart facility. What we're trying to do is create smaller pocket decentralized infrastructure across whichever communities we're coming from. In LA, we're lucky that we're finally gaining access to city parks. There's 15,000 acres of city parks in the city of LA alone, over 500 parks. That's a lot of space that we get to work on over the next 10, 20 years. It took 1.5 years, but we finally got Griffith Park, a 4,000-acre park. And what does that do for the movement collectively to show that it's not just on a backyard or a schoolyard, but in actual infrastructure, in city planning, and they're being mindful of it. And that should be the norm across California. It shouldn't just be backyard, side yard, kind of hidden concept. Now let's collectively bring this to the front. Let's collectively bring this to the streets. And let's collectively show and demystify what compost is not. It's not scary, it doesn't smell, it's not poop, it's not just manure. It is life-giving. It is a material that is selfless, that gives itself away. And the very process of creating it is very life-giving as well. Sifting, screening, you'll see that we kind of overdid it. So when you see our infrastructure at our LA compost sites, don't think that's the norm. We're just like, oh yeah, a $5,000 sifter, let's write a grant for that and that'd be cool. And it's really not necessary for certain scales, and the sifting process itself, once it's finished, is also not necessary depending on how you're using the finished compost. If it's solely a covered application on farm, sifted just looks prettier. It's where all the Instagram posts come from. It's where people get to show their coffee ground like compost. But just kind of your schedule is so important. You accept materials, you weigh it, you decide how you're going to deposit it in that infrastructure. If you have a 3-bin, making sure it's going into the in bin, not the cooking or curing bin. If you have a wire mesh bin that's already full, making sure you're starting a new one. If you're doing a windrow, making sure you're putting it in the right space. I don't bake, but if the composting process was like baking, you have your prep, you have your in the oven, and you have on the shelf to cool off. When I'm mixing my ingredients in my KitchenAid, I'm not going to put it on the oven to cool off because it hasn't cooked. Similarly with your feedstocks, when you receive it, you have to know the flow of your space and where things need to go. Our staff kind of is starting to create little aerial maps, and it's really fun. Little maps that show the date of when that pile was built, when material was deposited, and they even have fun just naming them, you know? Oh, Maximiliano, yeah, we got to serve him. Oh, Socorro, yeah, we got to turn her. I'm just like, what are these names? But cool, like, are these volunteers? But have fun with it. Make it your own, but make it consistent and make sure that everyone knows what you're saying and what you're doing. Because one of the things we've also done is we've created subplans. So when someone is sick and someone is out, you can hand someone your subplans and they know exactly the flow of the day, exactly what they need to do. And there's no confusion about where the water key is, what the code is to the container that's holding your pitchforks, the waivers that need to be signed by volunteers. Knowledge sharing and consistent knowledge sharing is really key. You receive, you record, you deposit, you turn, and you maintain the piles as well. I know yesterday Lynn spoke of the compost thermometer. That's really the only way the pile speaks to us. So its temperature really shows us where it's on that mesophilic thermophilic maturation phase. So really using that compost thermometer and getting the right length one as well. I know the little backyard bin ones are like 24 inches. If you're doing a windrow, you're not getting an accurate read on the temperatures of your compost pile. You want a 3-foot compost thermometer. You want to be able to take readings from different parts of the piles. And RioTemp, the official compost thermometer, we're actually going to get a pretty significant discount as a collective. So all of our sites will get the appropriate compost thermometer at a solid rate. So another important thing with our buckets, with our totes, is when we wash them, right? Every time we wash and rinse, that's another resource that we can deposit back into our pile, right? All that juicy, sloppy, food scrappy water, throw it right back into your windrow. Another thing about being intentional is where are you throwing it? Are you throwing it in the curing, maturing, ready to be sifted next week pile? It's kind of going to mess things up, right? Are we throwing it in the area that we just built, or perhaps even the cooking area? Everything that we do, be mindful, be thoughtful, be intentional about it. But everything that we do is essentially a maestro or maestra of resources. You're facilitating movement of resources in a designated space, similar with the human capacity. It's going to be tough for all of you to do something this afternoon at an LA compost site, but when people are showing up, is there a flow? Is there structure for them to know where they can step in and support? And it's really important that we take the time to explain this process. Okay, can you take the time to weigh these bins? They're over 100 pounds, so let's make sure it's 2 people. Okay, once they're weighed, can these individuals be the ones that are depositing it in the windrow? We need the mulching crew. Mulching is very hydrophobic, so I want to make sure you're pre-watering the mulching prior to us doing that 2-to-1 coverage ratio. Oh, and you here, you can actually turn the actual cooking process, and everything is a teachable moment, and you just become a facilitator of work and energy moved, and don't have to do the work if it's done well. Next one we're going to talk about is just like the different scales of composting. Again, in that planning process, what are your feedstocks? Who's the community that you're engaging with? How many people are going to get involved? So you're not over-promising, right? Oh yeah, we have space for 2 wire bins and I'm going to open up 4 farmers markets. It's not going to match. Make sure that the materials you're going to capture match the capacity and space that you have. There's nothing wrong with home-scale composting. I actually love it because it really embodies the network that's taking place below the ground. I always use the metaphor that the mycelia network is like the LA freeway system, or like the internet. It's just this beautiful interconnected web where resources are shared, things are communicated, and it's just this strength and resiliency through that collective complex network. Home-scale composting is a glimpse of what that network can look like when individuals do this in their individual yards. There's a variety of bins out there. I'm sure we've all seen the city and county municipal bins that they offer for free or a subsidized rate. The black plastic earth machines or soil saver. I'd recommend doing a batch system, so a minimum of 2 if you have the space and capacity. Because these home bins, they're designed where you're putting your mulch layer, you're doing your lasagna, and then you have to harvest from the bottom, but you're always adding to it, and it's like the oven metaphor. You're constantly adding fresh ingredients to the oven where that material that was in the oven hasn't had a chance to rise and to cook. So if you can do a batch system, you're gonna fill up that first one at the home, and then you're gonna start that second one. What's really interesting with these home systems, but these like black compost city bins, it's really hard to harvest. It's really hard to get that material from the bottom. I've always taught people, if you have the capacity, to lift it and place it right next to where it was. You have this beautiful jello mold of organic material that you can just access and refill and so on. The wire bin's a beautiful bin. It's a $5 bin with some chicken wire, hardware cloth, and zip ties. You can easily see all your materials, easily water the entire pile, and the grates easily allow for you to stick a thermometer all throughout and anywhere. You want to make sure those are covered, depending on where you're at, but we're all in California, so we get a lot of sun. Those piles will just dry out super quickly. Tumblers, nice concept, cool for a few people, but they're just so hard to manage the moisture. They either dry out or they're just soaking wet. Some of them are insulated. We don't need that in California. What's nice is sometimes they're elevated and they're enclosed, so it kind of keeps the friends and little critters out that we're afraid of. But if you're going to do a tumbler, try to do a batch system. Rather than a single cylinder, one with 2 doors. And then we also do the 3-bin system, but similar to a medium scale site or a home site. Access to water, storage for their carbon, where are their materials coming from, and what's that flow and what's that consistency going to look like. We just launched a program called the Soil Farmer Program. It's similar to San Diego, but not entirely what Food to Soil is doing. And it's just basically supporting the individual at the home level to find joy in their green space, to compost, to grow, to share. And it's really beautiful how this network, you'll meet Johnny from our staff later this afternoon, is just really sharing with one another, is just really coexisting well with one another, knowing each other by name. This is what I grew, would you like some? Erica from our team is also facilitating these spaces, and it's in close proximity of a community hub. So if they need mulch, where do they go? The community hub. If they need seedlings, the community hub. If they need overs from our compost pile to inoculate their new pile, the community hub right down the street. And I think that's the beauty of community composting. It's just this beautiful complex web that we get to be small facilitators in. So the next system I want to briefly talk about is a 3-bin system. We've been building these for about 8 years. We typically did 3 foot by 9 feet, but now we're doing 4 feet by 12 feet, just more volume, more temperatures, more thermophilic activity. We're going to be finalizing some IKEA-like drawing and plans so that we can just open source and share that with all of you. You don't have to follow it verbatim. You can kind of make it your own, but we've been doing it for a while and we know what works and what doesn't, what lasts and what doesn't, which wood we'd recommend, which non-VOC stain we'd recommend. But the 3-bin system's nice because people think, oh, it's beautiful. Like, it's incredible the responses I get from folks. Oh, are you raising pigeons? I'm like, pigeons? Like, Apparently that's a thing. Like they race them, and oh, is this your chicken coop? Or oh, like when are the rabbits coming? But it's like just a nice box, and it's separated into 3 sections. The first bin at LA Compost we use is like our fill bin, right? People are coming, they're weighing, they're dropping off, they're covering with their carbon. As it fills, one of our compost managers, alongside our cooperative members, will then remove that material and assess the situation. Oof, it's putrid. That's way too much nitrogen and not enough carbon. So what they're going to do is they're going to add that bulking agent and basically get it to a place where it can actually cook and have the porosity for airflow to actually run through it. I have a 2 and a 4-year-old, and if I gave them a bowl and said, mix the ingredients for the cake, there'd probably be like toothpaste and like a Paw Patrol toy and maybe an egg. So what we do, thankfully it's not as bad as our compost hub sites, we assess how it's been filled, and we add the ingredients or remove anything that's been over added essentially. And then that center bin just kind of cooks for a few weeks. We're constantly managing it, we're watering, we're checking the temperature. And then the final stage in that 3rd bin is to allow for it to cure and to mature. So again, the cooking scenario, Vitamix, mixing, whisking, in the oven, don't add, and then let it cure and mature. And we have little signs outside the 3-bin system in English, Spanish, or language appropriate to the community, so that it's very specific and very clear where they add, where they don't, and where they can sift or get finished compost for their own gardening needs. The next system is one of my favorites, and it's no system. It's just a windrow, it's a pile. It's very low cost. You can process the most amount of feedstocks and material. And when you have a decent sized group and enough tools and pitchforks, it's really beautiful for people to actually see the process of compost right in front of them. You crack open one of these windrows, a bunch of steam comes out, and then you kind of just field a bunch of questions. Everything is a teachable moment with the windrow. You see the actinobacteria and you kind of talk about what that does in the pile. Or you see the macroorganisms, the things that are crawling in and around the pile and what that does. But I love windrows because of the community engagement aspect, the amount of feedstocks that you can process, and just how flexible they are. We do everything by hand at LA Compost. This year we are ordering our first electric tractor, so I'm really excited to see how that works and if in fact it can lift anything. But yeah, for us at LA Compost, we have different scales of sites. So we have the individual micro hubs, we have our community cooperative hubs, and then we have our regional hubs, which take place at parks or urban farms. And all of our regional hubs have these windrows. They either have 2 long windrows, 3 long windrows. Again, it depends on the site specific, the specific site plan. But what's consistent across all of them is the management style. We know, just by showing up to a regional hub, you know how old material is, obviously. Obviously it's dark, crumbly, almost like coffee grounds. That's obviously not fresh material. Stuff that's fresh, brown, covered in mulch, you know that's your fresh feedstocks. When we show up today, you'll see probably like 20 totes of food scraps chilling next to the windrow pile. So what we'll do is we'll crack open an area of the windrow and water it really well. That's kind of our platform for where we're going to be adding our materials. It's not a competition, it's not an opportunity for you to show, wow, I could throw 150 pounds in the air. We always try to take the time to train people how to use tools and how to move their bodies. We're inside a lot of the time, we're using our computers, our phones. It's recalibrating our brains and reminding people how to work effectively and in a safe way. So when we crack it open, we'll put our food scraps, we'll water, we'll layer our carbon, and we're gonna kind of repeat that process until it's fully covered. It's always important, and this is kind of preaching to the choir, to never leave food scraps exposed, especially in an area like a park, an urban farm, or community garden that's heavily condensed with single-family residents. We keep our aisles clean, so we're always raking around the aisles. And then we use this compost text cover. It's like the community composting cover. It's like the Gore-Tex version of what the large-scale industry uses, but it's almost like a glorified felt. And I'll show it to you later today. It helps retain the moisture. It kind of keeps things out, but it's also not needed if we don't have the budget for it. A simple biofilter of overs or 4 to 6 inches of mulch is totally fine across your windrow. But we come, we add, we layer, we turn, you'll see some sifting, and then we also feed the vermicompost bins as well, all throughout that space.
All right, so I'm going to talk about our kind of windrow management system. EcoFarm is a model that Eleanor and some of our folks in the Inland Empire have been working on, like Ellie and Elizabeth. And EcoFarm stands for Ecological and Community-Oriented Farming and Resource Management. So really integrating the whole kind of community compost and urban farm model together. And to Thursday afternoon, we'll get to visit some of those sites. The Buena Vista Community Garden is based off of the EcoFarm concept. So we also do kind of open piles, kind of windrow style piles, but they're a little bit different. LA Compost, they kind of section off the windrow into thirds. So the fresh material goes into the first third of the pile, gets turned into the second third for the active kind of compost. And then the third part is more maturing and then goes into a second windrow for like full maturation. And for us, we kind of have like 2 or 3 rows of windrows as well, but we kind of keep the first row as our kind of fresh piles that we build, and then we turn those fresh piles into the second row, so that's kind of separated out. That's our active compost windrow, and then we turn that into third row, which is our maturation windrow. So it's a little slightly different kind of configuration and management of the windrow systems, but it is similar kind of in concept to what LA Compost is doing, but you'll get to see kind of 2 different sort of windrow management systems.
Another type of system that we've developed that is more of a pilot was a forced aeration, aerated static pile. Most large-scale compost infrastructure has like an aerated pad, so I should probably put it on. Sorry. If you ever played air hockey in your life, it's kind of like that. It's got those perforated holes, forced aeration from the floor, and they're building their piles on that floor bed to allow for forced aeration to kind of go through this chimney effect throughout the pile. We can't afford that. We don't have that space, so we kind of create it at the scale in which we know how to operate. We built a 3-bin, put a solar panel, and do we know like the kids' bouncy houses, like those like the little bounce houses, you know, those fans? We kind of rigged one of those up with 3 PVC pipes going into each of the bins. And we have a knife gate to close off the air depending on where we want the air to flow. Basically set it up on a timer, and for each bin that requires air, it's on a timer. So there's no turning required. We're basically adding our inputs, layering our inputs, and we set the timer for the fan to turn on for 2-3 minutes throughout the day to allow for that forced aeration to mimic what a pitchfork would do. This system's a cool concept, a little costly with like the batteries, inverters, and things like that, and we can help set something like this up if you wanted to try it in your community. Going back on it, I feel like it's a great concept, and if you can utilize this concept with a windrow, I think it actually would be more effective, because with the 4x12, you only have so much square footage to actually build compost. But if you did this system and ran PVC throughout the entirety of the length of your windrow, it's more effective and you have more capacity to process. Industrial ESP, as I mentioned, similar concept, but with either a forced aerated floor pad or a series of fans all throughout their 20+ piles. Most industrial ESPs use the Gore-Tex cover with the forced aeration, and the Gore-Tex is just kind of like the brand that rain jackets are made out of that allows things to breathe but keeps water out. That same concept is used for compost piles to allow things to breathe and keep water out during the hot summer days. Here at the community scale level, we're just a little innovative in terms of how we use large-scale concepts to fit the community spaces that we're working in. Mid-scale compost management. So as you kind of graduate or go beyond the backyard, the community scale, and have access to urban farms or parks, you're going to want to think about how you actually move large amounts of material, large amounts of feedstocks. Sure, a bucket brigade or 20 folks with pitchforks is a great concept, but if you have the capacity, if the farm has the infrastructure on site, a bucket loader, skid steer, excavator, these types of tools just move material so much quicker or easier on your back. And again, if they're available, let's be mindful of how to use them. There's some stand behind tractors. There's some sit-in ones. Just be mindful of insurance, depending on if we're working with a nonprofit, if we're creating your own organization. Insurance premiums typically change when you incorporate or involve these types of tools and infrastructure in your operation. We tried the Sherpa at our site at Debs. Unfortunately, our site at Debs is all mulch and soil, so it was kind of just like sinking. And if you are thinking about buying one of these in the future, I'd always recommend testing it out. It's a huge purchase. You're going to be using it weekly. You want to make sure that your staff, your team is trained, and it's actually making your life easier. Is it faster to turn by hand, or is this type of infrastructure actually going to support your process? Tracking feedstocks, as I mentioned. We hire compost managers. We have 3 here today from LA Compost, and we try to hire from within the community so folks can facilitate a cluster of hubs from the areas in which they were born, raised, or worked in. And it's really important that each manager kind of knows the job responsibilities of a compost manager. So as I mentioned, they can go from different region to region throughout LA. But having the compost manager or your site operators understand that metrics collection and recording is so important, not just in general, but also for this grant, is great, because then they can facilitate and delegate that work to the team as well. When it comes to wood chips, it's nearly impossible to get an exact reading on wood chips. So the typical range of wood chips is about 400 to 800 pounds for 1 cubic yard. So we were conservative and went closer to that 500-600 pounds every time we get a cubic yard of mulch. And the way to calculate that is when you get a chip drop or a landscape does a dump, you ask what size of truck, or how full was your truck. You ask them 2 questions. What's the size of your truck, and what's the load of the truck that you're bringing me? Because they might have a 20-yard truck, but they're bringing you at a quarter capacity. You don't want to lie about our metrics. We want to be really accurate. At the same time, if they're bringing you a 40-yard dump, and you don't want to just put 5 yards of carbon, right? You'll be surprised that when you start tracking your carbon metrics, how our organic diversion really shoots up. Similar with manures, how we're capturing those, how we're measuring those. One of the things that we've been told to be mindful with manures is just like, how is the horse owner like medicating the horse, the dewormeries, like all the stuff that the horse takes, just to be mindful, to let it cure, mature, or which manures you actually want to use. And then of course, all of this is going to actually support our overall GHG reductions if it's coupled with our tree plantings and both diversion and compost creation. And then identifying what our capacity is so important, right? Because that's going to inform your decisions for actual processing and what you actually do and what system you're actually going to use. Our food scrap drop-off collection across our community hubs varies. There's open hours, there's 24/7 drop-off, there's once or twice a month drop-offs. So it's really important for you to recognize that we want to make sure that there's a minimum of 4 hours a week that we're opening to the community on a weekly basis, and identify with the site partner what's going to be the best option. Do you own the land? Is it a friend? Is it a nonprofit? Is it an org partner? And what are they comfortable with? Some of our gardens are totally fine with having a combination code for the drop-off members to have access to it and come as they please. What are the liabilities and what forms need to be signed when someone enters a space? Just being mindful of that. And what's your capacity? How are you going to kind of turn off the faucet when you've reached 80 to 100 families and you're working with a 3-bin system? We ran into the issue, it's like, oh great, yeah, we have a 3-bin system, people keep signing up. We have 250 people showing up to this garden. Thankfully, we had WINDROWS there, we had the ability to have an overflow, but it's important to really understand what's your cutoff. If you have a 3-bin, it's probably within 50, 60 families. If you have a farmer's market collection and it grows, you're gonna get 200 to 500 families showing up in a year or 2. Do you have the space at your farm, at your garden, at your park to process all that? One of the things we really like is we created kind of this cooperative model so that people have to sign up and be a part of the cooperative to drop off. So the work and maintenance of the pile is not just on the compost manager, but collectively spread out and distributed across cooperative members. So as signing up for the cooperative, you promise or you give your word that you're going to support and volunteer X amount of hours throughout the year. What that does is it spreads 50 to 60 families all throughout the 52 weeks of the year to have a family support a few times throughout the year. And that's a really great concept because it's like the work is spread out collectively. When there's no mulch, it's like, well, we'll see when Penn arrives and fills it up. No, they're proactive about filling it up themselves. If they see contaminants that we don't accept, they take it out themselves. There's ownership, investment, and appreciation for the whole process. One of the things that we've done is we've had bins either on the sidewalk or behind gates, and we kind of combination code the lids. So when someone like Lynn were to actually try to sign up for it, she would sign her waiver form, she would get the combo code to the lid, and she can show up during the open hours or any time throughout the week that's convenient for her to access it. Spanish and English signage says what we do and don't accept. She puts her food scraps, she's not done. She has to cover it with mulch with the bin that's right next door. So then what the compost manager is going to do is he or she or they are going to weigh that bin or tote once they process it. In the past, we've tried to have people weigh it when they show up. Here's your little hanging scale, here's the process. You're going to get about 10 to 15% of folks actually capturing that. So you can still do that, but it's really important to have a system that captures more accurate metrics as well. So oftentimes we actually have a tote outside of the bin that we're actually processing. So all the feedstocks go in that tote. We can weight the bin and get an accurate reading on that what we collected before we process it. The scale that were recommended by like the New York group that's been doing it for like 20 years was these dynamo scales. They have about a 400 weight capacity. They're electric. The reading isn't as accurate when it's in full sun, but we've seen these last the longest. We've had some for about 2.5 years now. They're about $100 each, but they're sturdy. You know, you need a scale that's going to be able to get a little wet. It's going to take on like volunteers dumping totes on it. And we've just had success with that as well. Temperature monitoring, process for further reducing pathogens, I believe was talked about yesterday. Again, the temperature is really showing where in this process we are with composting. Rio Temp, as I said, is giving us a great deal to actually do this collectively and are excited to sponsor our work. Backyard bins are like 20 to 24 inches, great for backyard bins. If you're doing larger windrows, at a minimum of 36 inches is great. There's also probe guards because when you stick it in, oftentimes the little bezel will bend as well. And then there's also a 5/16 width that you're going to want to get because we've also just bent and broke so many thermometers because you're trying to stick it in, it hits a coconut. You're sticking it in, it hits a patch of really thick mulch, and you don't want to be bending or breaking $100, $150 instruments throughout the year. You kind of just want to be mindful of those tools, rinsing them off, storing them in the shade, recalibrating them as you need. Yeah, just taking care of your tools at the end of the day. Again, water is so important. Without it, we just have piles of mulch and rotting food scraps. Yeah, I'm sure you can get something of value, but moisture is really important. Squeeze tests, they have moisture meters. I don't think you need to buy them. You have 2 free ones right here. You can do the squeeze test, and we'll do some later this afternoon and show like the different moisture content based off of how the material holds, how it drips, how it breaks apart rather quickly. The beautiful thing about composting is that anything that goes wrong with it, the 4 ingredients, carbons, nitrogen, air, and water, are also the 4 solutions for most and all troubleshooting that you have, right? It's not getting hot enough, nitrogen, air. It starts to stink, aerate, some carbon coverage. Yeah, again, learning is in the doing. It's both a science and art. No 2 piles are alike, but I think you kind of establish some consistency once you establish your recipe, once you establish your flow. And like I said, you're gonna get something of value, and we can do some tests to actually show that there's actually life in your compost. But yeah, I'm looking forward to talking more to you all in person and kind of showing some of our sites. So thank you. Thank you.